Just send it now, Daniel. We don't have time to argue about this anymore. My mother's voice was calm, which was the scariest part about it. It was too calm, like a lake right before a massive storm hits the shore. I stood in our small kitchen, staring at the banking app on my glowing phone screen. The number staring back at me represented 5 long years of my life. It was 5 years of working 2 jobs, 5 years of late nights fueled by cheap coffee, and 5 years of skipping every single vacation. I had said no to every party and every expensive dinner just to see that number grow. Are you absolutely sure this is temporary, Mom? I asked, my thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't even blink. Of course it is, Daniel. We are family. Family helps each other when things get hard. She said those words with a practiced ease, but I noticed something chilling. She didn't say thank you. She didn't mention how hard I had worked for this. She just said we're family. As if that phrase was a key that unlocked my vault. For the first time in my life, something didn't add up. The math of her love was starting to look like a bad debt. I took a deep breath and pressed the transfer button. In a second, 8,400,000 Nigerian nairas was gone. My account balance dropped so fast it made my head spin. My younger brother, Kelvin, was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed over his chest. He was watching the whole thing like it was some kind of free entertainment. He didn't look worried about the family emergency at all. Instead, he had a tiny smirk on his face that he was trying to hide behind his hand. "Relax, big brother," Kelvin said, his voice dripping with a fake kind of sympathy. "It's just money. You're acting like the world is ending." Just money. I looked at him and nodded slowly, but I wasn't really agreeing with him. What bothered me wasn't the loss of the cash. It was how prepared they both seemed for this specific moment. It felt like they had rehearsed this scene in their heads a dozen times before I even walked through the door. They weren't reacting like people who had just been saved from a disaster. They were reacting like people who had just finished a successful business deal. I put my phone in my pocket and felt a strange, cold shiver run down my spine. The game had officially started. This whole disaster didn't actually begin with that digital transfer in the kitchen. If I really think about it, the crack started showing about 6 months earlier. It began with small things that seemed normal at the time, but feel heavy now. There were conversations that felt a bit too rehearsed, like they were reading from a script. My mom would sit me down for dinner and casually ask, "So, Daniel, how much have you managed to save up now? You must be getting close to your goal." Then Kelvin would chime in with his usual joking tone, saying things like, "Hey, big man, don't forget your humble family when you finally blow and become a superstar." Back then, I thought it was just family pride. I thought they were rooting for me. I would smile and give them rough estimates, thinking I was sharing my success with the people who loved me most. Looking back at those dinners now, I realized I wasn't sharing my dreams. I was giving them a progress report on their future bank account. It wasn't interest, it was reconnaissance. They were measuring the size of the harvest before they decided when to cut it down. I was too blinded by the idea of family to see the hunters standing right in front of me. That money wasn't just a random pile of cash I was hoarding for fun. It was for something very specific and very important to my future. I had been planning to start a small logistics company for over 2 years. I spent my weekends building spreadsheets, finding supplier contacts, and scouting for warehouse locations. I had a vision of trucks moving across the country, building a brand from the ground up. It was my ticket out of the cycle of poverty that had followed our family for generations. I didn't tell many people about the fine details because I wanted to be sure first. But I told my mom everything. I showed her my business plans and the logos I had designed. I told her because she always looked me in the eye and said, "Whatever you do, Daniel, I am right behind you. I am your biggest fan." I believed her with every fiber of my being. That is exactly what made this betrayal hurt in a way that I can't quite describe. It wasn't just that the money was gone. It was that the dream was being held hostage by the person who promised to protect it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my trucks, but when I opened them, I saw my empty bank account. About 2 months before the emergency happened, I noticed a shift in my mother's behavior. It was subtle at first, like a change in the wind before a storm. She stopped asking about my business plan and started talking about family responsibility almost every single day. She would tell stories about distant relatives who had abandoned their families and how they ended up miserable and alone. It felt like she was trying to plant a seed of fear in my mind. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, she sat me down and said something that felt like a cold splash of water. "Daniel, if something really bad happened, you would do whatever it took to help us, right? You wouldn't let your own blood suffer while you had plenty." I laughed it off at the time, telling her of course I would, but she didn't laugh back. She held eye contact with me longer than she ever had before. Her gaze was intense, almost demanding a silent vow. That was the moment I should have realized that she wasn't talking about a what-if scenario. She was preparing the ground for the win. She was making sure my guilt was locked in place before she made her move. I felt a tiny bit of unease, but I pushed it down. The reason for the big emergency finally came, and it came very quickly. One afternoon, my mom called me into the living room. She looked like she had been crying, and her hands were shaking. She told me that Kelvin had gotten into some serious business trouble. Apparently, he had been trying to start a deal that went completely south. Investors were pulling out, and there was an urgent need for capital to cover some mysterious debts. My mom framed the whole situation perfectly, like a tragic movie. "Daniel, if we don't fix this right now, everything will collapse. Your brother could lose everything. The family name will be ruined." She kept using that word, everything. It did a lot of heavy lifting in her sentences. She made it sound like if I didn't give up my savings, our entire world would stop spinning. Kelvin sat in the corner, looking down at his shoes, acting like a broken man. He didn't say a word, which was unlike him. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. My mom grabbed my hand and looked at me with pleading eyes. She knew exactly which buttons to press to make me feel like the villain if I even hesitated. She was using my own success as a weapon against me. They were very clever about how they did it. They didn't come out and demand the money in a mean way. Instead, they layered the pressure on me slowly, like coats of paint. First, there was the deep concern. Then came the long periods of sad silence. If I walked into a room, they would stop talking and look away with disappointment. My mom would sigh loudly while she was cooking, making sure I heard it from the other room. Then came the final guilt trip. "You're the only one who can help us, Daniel," she whispered one night. She didn't say I should help. She said I was the only one who could. It was a trap designed to make me feel powerful and responsible at the same time. By making me the hero, they were actually making me their victim. I started to notice that they had already stopped talking about the money as if it belonged to me. They talked about it as if it was a family resource that I was just holding on to selfishly. They had already counted the 8,400,000 Nigerian nairas as theirs. In their minds, I wasn't giving them a gift. I was just returning what they thought was theirs by right of blood. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Here's the part of the story that nobody knows, and the part that my family definitely didn't expect. By the time they sat me down for that final, tearful meeting in the kitchen, I had already started moving most of my money. I'm not as naive as they thought I was. My years of working in high-pressure jobs had taught me to watch for red flags, and my family was waving dozens of them. The bank account they saw on my phone that morning, it wasn't the real one. It was a secondary account I had set up months ago when I first started feeling uneasy. I had left exactly 8,400,000 Nigerian nairas in there, just enough to make the emergency request feel believable and to satisfy their greed. The rest of my hard-earned savings, the real bulk of my logistics fund, was tucked away in an account they didn't even know existed. I did this because something deep in my gut was screaming at me. It told me that this wasn't a cry for help. It was a planned extraction. I wanted to see if my own mother would really take every last cent from me if she thought that was all I had. It was a test, and sadly, it was a test she was about to fail with flying colors. I honestly could have refused right then and there. I could have stood my ground, called out their lies, and walked away with my money and my pride. I could have confronted Kelvin and asked for the receipts of his failed business. But I knew if I did that, it would have ended everything quietly and quickly. They would have denied it, called me names, and we would have gone our separate ways. But I needed to understand something much deeper than just a lie. I needed to see the full extent of their plan. I needed to know exactly how far my own mother and brother would go to take advantage of me. Would they stop at the money, or was there more? Would they feel guilty once they had the cash in their hands? I needed to see their true faces when they thought they had won. So, I looked my mother in the eye, pretended to be the self-sacrificing son they wanted, and said yes. I played the part perfectly. I let my voice shake a little. I let them see me struggle with the decision. I wanted them to believe they had successfully manipulated me. I was playing a game of chess while they thought we were just having a family discussion. The energy in the house changed almost the very second the transfer was completed. It was like a mask had been removed. There was no more crying for my mother. There was no more broken silence from Kelvin. In fact, there was no gratitude at all. I expected at least a hug or a sincere, "Thank you, Daniel. You saved us." But there was nothing. Everything just went back to normal far too quickly. It was eerie. My mom went back to humming while she cleaned the house, and Kelvin was suddenly back on his phone, laughing at videos. It was as if the catastrophe that was supposedly going to ruin our family name had never existed. Kelvin didn't even bother to give me an update on how he was using the money to fix his business. My mom completely stopped mentioning the debt or the emergency. That's when the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for me. They never, ever planned to return a single cent of that money. They viewed that transfer as a final payment, a tax I owed them for being successful. I sat in my room that night, listening to them laugh in the living room, and I realized I was officially a stranger in my own home. I decided to wait exactly 1 week before I made my move. I wanted to give them enough time to get comfortable with the money. On a Sunday afternoon, while we were all sitting in the living room, I asked Kelvin casually, "Hey, how's the business recovery going? Did that capital help smooth things over with the investors?" Kelvin didn't even look up from his laptop. He just gave a tiny shrug and said, "Still working on it, man. These things take time, you know. Don't stress about it." There were no details given. There was no sense of urgency or relief. It was the answer of someone who didn't have a business to recover. My mother just nodded in agreement, not saying a word. Their lack of a story was the biggest clue of all. If you truly lose 8 million Nigerian nairas and someone saves you, you usually have a lot to say about it. Their silence was deafening. That was the moment I decided to stop being the good son and start being the private investigator. I had the tools and the time, and I was going to find out exactly where my 5 years of hard work had gone. I started digging that very night, and what I found was worse than I imagined. I started my investigation with Kelvin's failing business. I searched for the company name he had mentioned months ago. I checked the National Business Registry and looked for any tax filings or office leases. As I suspected, the company didn't actually exist. There was no record of Kelvin's logistics or whatever fake name he had used in passing. There were no investors pulling out because there were no investors to begin with. It was a complete ghost story. But as I dug deeper into his digital footprint, I found something else entirely. I found a recent property listing that had been marked as rented just 4 days after I made the transfer. The name on the digital lease agreement wasn't a company. It was Kelvin's full name. I looked at the address and felt a knot form in my stomach. It was a high-end apartment complex in one of the most expensive parts of the city. The monthly rent was astronomical, and the security deposit alone would have taken a massive chunk out of my savings. My struggling brother wasn't paying off debts or saving a business. He was moving into a palace while I was still living in my small childhood bedroom, trying to build a future from nothing. The betrayal was now documented in black and white. 3 days after I found the listing, I decided to see it for myself. I drove across the city to the address I had found. I saw the building, a sleek, modern apartment complex with a glass front and a 24-hour security guard at the gate. It was the kind of place people move to when they want everyone to know they've finally made it. I stood across the street, watching as a delivery truck pulled up. 2 men started unloading brand new, high-end furniture. I saw a massive leather sofa, a 75-inch television, and boxes that clearly contained expensive kitchen appliances. Then I saw him. Kelvin walked out of the lobby, pointing at where he wanted the furniture to go. He was wearing new clothes and a pair of sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He looked happy, confident, and completely unbothered by the fact that he had stolen this life from his own brother. Everything was being funded almost exactly by the amount I had transferred to save him. I stood there in the shadows for a long time, watching my dream be turned into a bachelor pad. I didn't get angry, though. I actually smiled. I smiled because the truth was finally clear, and now I knew exactly how to handle it. The reality of the situation was finally out in the open. They didn't need help, and they weren't in any danger. They just wanted a massive lifestyle upgrade, and they didn't want to work for it like I did. They saw my savings as a shortcut to the life they thought they deserved. They used my love, my guilt, and my hard work to buy leather sofas and big screen TVs. But as I sat in my car watching Kelvin, the worst part hit me. It wasn't about Kelvin's greed. It was about my mother. There was no way she didn't know about this. She was the one who had cried and pleaded with me. She was the one who had used the family card to get me to press that button. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the architect of the whole lie. She had chosen to sacrifice my future and my business so that her younger, favorite son could live like a king in a rented apartment. She had looked me in the eye and lied while knowing she was destroying my life's work. The woman who raised me had turned into a stranger who sold me out for a luxury apartment. That realization hurt more than the money ever could. Once the blindfold was off, I started checking everything else. I had a feeling that if they were willing to steal my cash, they might have taken more. I went to the local land registry office to check on a small plot of family land my father had left to me in his will. It wasn't worth millions, but it was mine, and I had planned to use it as collateral for my business loan. When the clerk pulled up the records, my heart stopped. My name was gone. The land had been transferred quietly nearly 4 months ago. I looked at the signature on the transfer document. It was my name, but the handwriting was slightly off. It was a forgery. And the witness who had signed off on the transfer? My mother. She had helped Kelvin steal my land while I was out working late nights to support them. They had been picking me clean for months, piece by piece, like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to stop moving. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, long-term plan to strip me of everything I owned before I could leave and start my own life. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to be their permanent ATM. At that very moment, standing in the dusty land registry office, everything inside me changed. The good son, who wanted to please his mother, died right then and there. This wasn't about money anymore, and it wasn't even about the land. This was about control. They wanted to make sure I stayed small so they could stay comfortable. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of long-term manipulation, and they thought I was the loser. But they forgot one thing. I spent my life in the logistics world. I knew how to track assets, I knew how to manage timelines, and I knew how to plan for every possible delay. If they wanted to play a long-term game, I was more than ready to show them how a professional plays. I wasn't going to scream, and I wasn't going to throw a tantrum. I was going to move silently, just like they had. I was going to build a case that was so airtight, they wouldn't be able to breathe when I finally closed it. They had had their fun for 6 months, but the next 6 months belonged to me. The shift was absolute. I walked out of that office with a cold, clear mind and a heart made of stone. My first move was to contact a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I found someone who specialized in white-collar crime and fraudulent property transfers. I met him in a quiet office far away from our neighborhood. I laid out everything I had found: the fake company, the bank transfer logs, the rented luxury apartment, and the forged land documents. We sat there for hours, reviewing the evidence. My lawyer was impressed with how much I had already collected. "You have a lot here, Daniel," he said, tapping the folder. "The land transfer is a clear case of forgery. The financial movement can be argued as a fraudulent misrepresentation because they lied about the purpose of the funds." He told me there was more than enough to take action, but I told him I didn't want a quiet settlement. I didn't just want my money back. I wanted total exposure. I wanted them to realize that they hadn't outsmarted anyone. I wanted the legal consequences to be so undeniable that they couldn't twist the story to make themselves the victims. My lawyer nodded and started drafting the first set of documents. We were building a trap, and we were going to make sure it was perfect before we sprung it. The hardest part was the waiting game. For the next month, I had to live in the same house as my mother and brother, pretending that I didn't know a thing. I ate dinner with them, watched TV with them, and even listened to them talk about how hard things were. It was the most difficult acting job of my life. Every time Kelvin bragged about a new business win, I just nodded and smiled, while in my pocket, my phone was recording every word he said. I saved every text message where they mentioned the emergency or the debt. I built a massive digital timeline of their lives, matching their stories against the reality of Kelvin's new apartment and the forged land papers. I collected receipts for everything. I even found out which notary had helped them forge the land documents and realized he was a friend of Kelvin's. I was building a mountain of evidence, layer by layer, brick by brick. I needed the case to be so strong that no amount of family guilt-tripping could knock it down. I was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth, and that moment was coming soon. I just had to stay patient and keep the mask on. 1 month later, I decided the time had finally come. I invited my mother and Kelvin to a nice dinner at a restaurant in the city. I told them it was my treat, a way to celebrate the family, getting through the hard times. My mom was thrilled. She put on her best dress and smiled at me like she was the proudest mother in the world. Kelvin arrived 20 minutes late, acting like a very busy and important man. He was wearing a shiny new watch that I immediately recognized from a luxury catalog I'd seen online. It was a watch that cost more than my first car, bought entirely with the money I had lent him to save his life. He sat down, ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, and started talking about his new connections. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. They were both so relaxed, so confident that they had won. They thought I was just the same old Daniel, the hardworking, gullible son who would always be there to foot the bill. They had no idea that this dinner was the final chapter of their lie. I watched them eat and felt a strange sense of calm. The trap was set. Halfway through the main course, I took a sip of water and looked at Kelvin. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation, but our table was about to become very quiet. "So, Kelvin," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I've been meaning to ask, when were you planning to tell me about the luxury apartment across town? The one with the 24-hour security and the new leather furniture?" The silence that followed was instant. It was like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Kelvin's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He laughed nervously, but it sounded hollow and fake. What apartment? I don't know what you're talking about, man. You've been working too hard." I didn't say a word. I just reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed it right in the center of the table. I tapped the screen and pressed play on a recording of him and my mother discussing how they were going to spend the logistics money on his new place. Their own voices filled the space between us, clear and undeniable. I watched as the color drained from their faces, starting from their foreheads and moving down to their necks. The mask was finally starting to crack. I didn't stop with the recording. I started laying out the rest of the evidence, like I was presenting a business report. I pulled out printed bank records showing exactly where the 8,400,000 Nigerian nairas had gone, to the apartment deposit, to the furniture store, and to Kelvin's personal shopping sprees. Next, I pulled out the land registry documents. I pointed to the forged signature and the notary's name. "This was a nice touch," I said, looking at my mother. "Selling my inheritance while I was at work. That's a level of betrayal I didn't think even you were capable of." Her face changed from shock to a strange, twisted kind of defensive anger. Kelvin's face was just pure panic. For the first time in their lives, they had absolutely nothing to say. They couldn't explain away the recordings. They couldn't lie about the bank statements. They couldn't pretend the forged land documents were a mistake. Layer by layer, I had stripped away every single one of their excuses until they were left standing naked in their own greed. The perfect family image they had worked so hard to maintain had collapsed in the middle of a crowded restaurant. It was a total, absolute defeat. It was just temporary, Daniel. We were going to put it back. My mother finally spoke, using the same tired line she had used in the kitchen. But this time, her voice was weak and shaky. It didn't have the power it used to. She looked at me, waiting for me to soften, waiting for the good son to come back and say it was okay. But then Kelvin did something that surprised even me. He didn't apologize. He didn't cry. He actually snapped. "So what?" he shouted, leaning across the table. "You had the money. You're the successful one. Why shouldn't you help your own brother live a better life? You're just being selfish." And there it was. The absolute truth. It wasn't guilt that they were feeling. It was entitlement. They genuinely believed that because I worked hard and saved, I owed them a luxury lifestyle. They didn't see their actions as theft. They saw them as balancing the scales. They felt they had a right to my life, just because we shared the same last name. My mother didn't even correct him. She just sat there, looking at me as if I was the one who had committed a crime by catching them. The betrayal was finally complete. I didn't argue with Kelvin. There was no point in arguing with someone who thinks they have a right to your soul. Instead, I slid one last document across the table. It was a formal legal notice from my lawyer. "This is a notice that I am officially disputing the land transfer," I explained calmly. "And because the funds used for that apartment were obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, we are freezing all associated assets tied to that transaction." Kelvin's eyes went wide as he realized what that meant. "Wait, the apartment?" I nodded. "The apartment, the furniture, the watch on your wrist, all of it is legally contested now. Since you used my money to pay for it under false pretenses, you won't be staying there much longer." My mother started to sob, but I didn't feel the usual pull of guilt. I just felt tired. I had reclaimed my property and my money, but I had lost my family in the process. I stood up, leaving the documents on the table. "The car is outside for you both," I said, "but don't expect me to be in it." I walked out of the restaurant and didn't look back. The final move had been made, and the game was over. The aftermath was messy, just like I knew it would be. Over the next few weeks, the luxury apartment deal completely collapsed as the legal freeze took effect. Kelvin was evicted, and most of the fancy furniture he had bought was taken back or sold to cover legal costs. The truth about the land forgery spread through our extended family like wildfire. Some relatives took my side, but many others called me heartless for taking legal action against my own mother. They said I should have just let it go for the sake of peace. But I didn't care anymore. I had found a kind of clarity that you can only get when you lose everything you thought was true. Winning the legal battle didn't feel like a celebration. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like walking out of a thick fog and finally seeing the world for what it really was. I got my land back, and I recovered most of my funds, but the house I grew up in was now a silent, empty place. I realized that you can't buy trust back once it's been sold, and you can't fix a family that sees you as an object rather than a person. It has been 6 months since that dinner, and I have finally started my logistics company. It's small, but it's mine, and every truck on the road is a symbol of the future I fought to keep. I still send my mother money every month for her basic needs. I haven't abandoned her to the streets because I am still the person she raised me to be. But I do not send her my trust. I don't share my plans with her, and I don't tell her how much I'm earning. That part of our relationship is gone, and it won't transfer twice. Kelvin is working a regular job now, complaining about the unfairness of life to anyone who will listen. I've learned a very hard lesson through all of this. When someone says, "It's for the family," you need to look very closely at who they are including in that definition. Sometimes family is just a word people use to wrap up their own greed and make it look like love. I am careful now. I am paying attention. I trust slowly, and I verify everything. I'm moving forward, one truck at a time, watching the road ahead and never looking back at the house that tried to keep me small.